Hello and welcome to SUMERSPORTS Live. I'm Quinn MacLean. I'm joined by our in-house college football expert, Parker Fleming. Tonight, we are going to preview the pinnacle of the college football playoffs, the new format, the national championship between number 8 Ohio State and number 7 Notre Dame in Atlanta on Monday, January 20th. As we dive into what to expect in this game and how to preview it, first, I want to kick it to you, Parker. Like, what exactly did we learn these first few rounds about these teams leading up to the national championship?
Yeah, great to see two teams that wouldn't have had a chance in the prior 14 playoff, given the seeding. Obviously, things might have changed there, but I also think what we've learned about both these teams. One, with Ohio State, we learned that good teams don't always play like good teams, but when they do play like good teams, they are very hard to beat. To disposing of a fierce Tennessee squad and just making the Oregon rematch a no contest, and then gutting out a pretty gutsy win there against Texas, kind of going blow for blow and making the decisive win at the end. Notre Dame, on the other hand, I think we've seen the value in college football of team chemistry and frankly, like team spirit and guys just believing in the mission. They've had a lot of injuries. They've had guys fill in, next man up culture all around. You've got Jeremiah Love with the knee brace, still hurdling people in the backfield. Yeah. Absolutely. The want to factor from Notre Dame is extremely high. Very impressive from them run. Cool to see this new kind of postseason run aspect, which is not something we've seen. It's been, hey, you get 2 games with a lot of space in between. And this has really been a ladder match, a true tournament. It's been fun to watch.
Yeah, I think the highlight and takeaways for me before we dive into these two teams is both these secondaries are amazing. If you like to see a high scoring game, this may not be the one to watch out for because of how clamped down these secondaries have been during the college football playoffs. And we've seen this in past rounds, and I think we will probably see this going into the national championship as well. And both these running games are great. I think this is one of the dichotomies where both these teams like to pass to set up the run, and they really get in the groove when they're trying to set these two running backs on the Ohio State side. Obviously, you touched on Love, and they've had a running back by committee with his injury throughout the college football playoffs. But those are the 2 takeaways for me when I talk with Notre Dame and Ohio State that I think is an exciting matchup for these teams. I think they do match up pretty well, which we'll kind of touch into. First, Parker, let's talk about Ohio State's offense versus Notre Dame's defense. Like, what should we expect for both these teams in this matchup?
Yeah, going to be really, really fun. I like your thought there, just about not a lot of scoring, because both of these defenses have been really good. I'm looking for a couple things here. Mostly explosiveness in the run game. I think that's really important for Ohio State here. And Quinn, I'm a weirdo. I'm going to call screens the run game. I think we're just going to lump those in there. We saw how valuable that was at Texas, kind of stealing a possession there at the end and getting a touchdown that really flipped the script and kind of squashed the Texas comeback there. They're towards the top in success rate, but much more explosive in terms of EPA per play than success rate. So the first key for me is explosiveness in the run game. They just got to be able to generate some of those plays. Against Notre Dame, you're going to see diverse fronts. You're going to see a fierce defensive line. How are they going to be able to utilize that 2-man running approach with Judkins and Henderson and find who's got the hot hand, who's got the vision on the field, who can break off that explosive run that kind of takes pressure off of Will Howard. That goes hand in hand, Quinn, with staying ahead early. Ohio State is much better on early downs than late downs relatively. And that's, Notre Dame's defense really great when the field is open in those early down situations. They're excellent when it is 3rd and long in those negative 3rd down situations. So how can Ohio State avoid kind of the bread and butter of the Notre Dame defense, where Al Golden's going to be able to dial up some diabolical pressures for Will Howard? And how can they get the ball kind of to their guys early and spread around? We talk about Jeremiah Smith only had 3 targets last game. Carnell Tate had a big game as well, but will they be able to, they're not presenting the same matchup as Warren for Notre Dame, for instance, and being kind of a matchup problem, but they're gonna have to use motion. They're gonna have to find ways to get the ball to their guys early and kind of spread it around on these high quality wide receivers and lean on their athleticism outside.
Yeah, that's really well said. I think a few different points I'll add on there is, for Ohio State offense, they're usually not in a great starting field position. They're number 72 in the nation in terms of starting field position. And I think that's more kudos to their defense, kind of pinning the opposing offenses deep and not giving their opposing offense as much to start with. So I think that's a thing I'm looking at from the Notre Dame defense. This is a team that really likes to operate on the margins and like get some efficiency out of that. They've been great on 4th down calls. They've their defense, from what you called up as far as Al Golden, like dialing up these blitzes from their linebackers and moving guys around in different stunts. I think that's hopefully that kind of comes to its head a bit against this Ohio State offense, which the whole narrative we've talked about going into every game with Ohio State is, how is this offensive line going to hold up? How is this offensive line going to hold up? But kudos to them. They've, with, Simmons and McLaughlin being out for the year, like Donovan Jackson, we've talked about moving over to left tackle. They've really held up well against good pressure attacks. I think I was expecting a little bit more damage going into that game against Texas, but it's really hard. And you've seen this in games against Oregon, to get Will Howard like uncomfortable and to really bring him down. And I think that's where teams have realized that. And they said, okay, if we're not going to stack him, let's at least put the ball in front of him to limit the damage that they can get to their explosive playmakers. And I think that's where, if I'm Notre Dame, I'm looking to as well, because the kryptonite for Notre Dame's defense is their ability to stop the run. And we saw that with Penn State. Their game plan was to take away Tyler Warren from the game plan. And with that came that the running backs kind of torched them a bit. And so I'm wondering if that's still the same game plan. Let's take out Egbuka and Smith, but let's still give Henderson and Judkins their day a little bit, which I think you have to pick your poison when it goes to the Ohio State offense a bit, which is kind of where I think it's a fascinating matchup from that standpoint. So I'm excited to see, Freeman and Al Golden's defense going up against Chip Kelly, another national championship for Chip Kelly to hopefully give himself a ring in terms of crowning himself on that. That's a homage there a little bit for me, but let's go into
Quinn's blatant Oregon fandom comes in even when we're being objective here. There's a couple of points there, Quinn, that I think is really interesting. One, there's a name you didn't say for Ohio State there, and it's just simply Ohio State could win this game with Carnell Tate as their leading receiver. So you could take away Smith and Egbuka. You could relatively bottle up Judkins and Henderson, and Carnell Tate could get you there, honestly. So I think that's really important. Two things about the offensive line that have been impressive this postseason as they've been injured and have been a concern that Ohio State has done. One is they've used tight ends to come in and try to leverage and get personnel in there that can help them block and cover those guys. That does limit the playbook and the formations. That's certainly correlated to, not getting the ball to their guys. Like we saw in the Texas game, they had to block in certain ways. But, the creativity there, I think it definitely helps you mitigate some of those potential weaknesses and kind of know the strength of your offensive line and play to it. Second, Quinn, there's a gravitas. I think people might call it pride. People might call it, having the dog in them. I call it hate. I think there's some absolute hate on some of these guys in the offensive line for Ohio State. I go back to that screenplay, and not to over-index on one play and make too much out of this, but I called it out on our live stream last week. Hinsman was downfield and made two blocks that just absolutely broke it over. Not one, but two, and was just downfield looking for somebody to hit, saying, "Hey, I'm gonna go get my guy a chance." And you love that kind of competitive spirit, that hate out of the offensive line for Ohio State in the midst of knowing, "Hey, we're banged up. Hey, we're not 100% here."
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I think another thing I'll add to this is I think Texas had the great game plan against Ohio State offense in terms of doing everything right to try to limit the explosive plays. Obviously, you take that Henderson play, the 70-yard screen out of it. Like, I think they did a really good job. They, as you mentioned, they bottled up Smith, and they have the secondary to do the exact same game plan as I think Texas did. Although we can talk about Texas being a little bit more skillful and athletic than the Notre Dame defense, but in terms of coverage and how those slot corners have played throughout the college football playoff, I think they can get pretty creative with the blitz structure that Al Golden has put in there. All right, Parker, let's switch gears a bit to Notre Dame's offense versus Ohio State's defense. What sticks out for you?
Well, the first thing that sticks out to me is just looking at, the rushing volume. Obviously, they played two service academies, so that does move that direction. But this is the best passing defense in the nation for the second year in a row, even with some of the injuries to key contributors. And I think because of that, there's so much respect from opposing offenses. They've seen a lot of rushing volume, and that really kind of worries me a little bit when you think about the selection and the splits there of, okay, can they hold up to a more diverse approach? Ohio State, very balanced on offense. They're able to run, they're able to pass. And so potentially that unlocks some kind of, nonlinear dependency. Like, hey, if I can run a little better, that means I can pass a little better, which then in turn means I can run a little better and kind of puts more pressure and stress on this defense. So right. That's what I'm looking on. One, Notre Dame is first in rushing EPA per play adjusted for opponent, but they are 33rd in success rate. So is that a path for Ohio State to, for Notre Dame? Can they stay successful enough? Can they stay on schedule enough to give themselves the opportunities to break the big run there? That's something I'm really worried about is like they might get the big run, but will it matter? Is it 18 yards on third down and 20 like we saw at one point? That doesn't really help you, right? You've got to get those on early downs and kind of stay ahead of it. And again, in the same situation, they're slightly better on early downs, but again, those late downs with that rushing attack, with Riley Leonard being 8 feet tall and just being able to fall forward for those 4th and shorts, even when they questionably line up in shotgun on some of those, he's able to get those first downs. But can they get into those favorable third down situations even? Can they do enough on early downs against this defense? We saw last week Penn State have a very rigorous game plan with the defensive ends playing spy. Ohio State has some really good defensive ends with JTT and Jack Sawyer there. But are either of those as talented as Abdul Carter, even with one arm? I don't know. I don't know if they can put that singular effort there. Ohio State might have to get more creative.
Yeah, and you mentioned a really key distinction here is what Notre Dame's offense looks like when they're backed up into these 3rd and long situations. We know that's when they end up struggling, and they do rely pretty heavily on early downs EPA per play. They're top 20 in the nation in terms of unadjusted early downs EPA per play. The one thing I can think that Notre Dame can do, and you saw this a little bit when Angeli came in and Riley Leonard was in the concussion protocol a little bit during that game, is they unlocked during this Penn State defense, and I think they could bring this into the Ohio State game, is that you can neutralize a really good passing attack by quick passes. And I'm wondering how much they involved their running backs, which we saw against Penn State with Williams and mixing in Love in terms of the passes into the flats, those quick passes outside to Evans, which they got on early on. A lot of that can take Jack Sawyer out of the game. And with JTT being mostly injured against that game against Texas, does that mean that your singular focus is to just neutralize Jack Sawyer, and then you're kind of take the Ohio State pass rush out of the game and you get the quick pass rushes, which builds up the confidence for Riley Leonard and he can be deceptive in terms of his scrambling ability. And as I've said, like with how mobile Riley Leonard is, they've got to figure out ability to have some of these design rollouts for him to kind of manufacture targets. And I think that's key against a team like Ohio State, which loves to keep their corners on an island a bit and move their safeties around and kind of mix and match. And, with their defense coordinator, Ohio State likes to make it as confusing as possible with the disguise coverage. I think that's where teams that actually have torched the Ohio State defense in the past have kind of targeted those corners that been left on an island a bit. So I think that's where I'm looking out for. And then to put it on a bow, and
torched is a relative word for what this Ohio State has done to everyone this season. But yes, like when teams have had success, and that's where you saw, I think the tight end Evans had a big gain early on where he kind of fell past a defender and stumbled a little bit and got a big play. Williams had a sneaky good game out of the backfield. So like if you take, if you try to avoid chunk yards to Faison and Bo Collins, and can you avoid giving up those plays underneath to Evans and Greathouse? There's kind of a back and forth there as well. Don't forget about Chris Mitchell, the FIU transfer, who hasn't been super productive this year, but has been very, very sneaky as well. So like Notre Dame does have some weapons, even if he haven't passed it down the field very often. They've had guys step up in key moments. I do think about what Notre Dame needs in like the yards after catch reality. And I come back to this play again, not to over index on one play, but like Caleb Downs' shoelace tackle saved a touchdown against Texas there. And again, completely changed the outcome of the game. That really took away what should have been a score for Texas. And, again, an offense that's very explosive. You want to force them to stay on schedule and have to get a lot of those repeats, successes. And that seems to be Ohio State's well suited for that.
Yeah, you made a good point that these Notre Dame wide receivers are really used to expand the field and create those explosive plays, where Evans is more of this possession receiver to get, chunk yardage, kind of that dink and dunk formula, which is a nice transition into us. Like, Parker, if you had to leave the audience with like one or two things to watch out for specifically in this game, what would those be?
Yeah, I think we if we have to drill it down, I'd kind of point it to two things. Notre Dame is excellent on defense when the field gets short. And so Ohio State is pretty good at finishing drives. Who's going to be able to capitalize in the plus zone when Ohio State has the ball, the offense or the defense there? I think that is really, really important. Ohio State could be in a situation, Quinn, we could be looking at halftime 9-0, feels like an absolute drubbing. but it's only 9 points. Does that sound familiar at all to a Notre Dame game that we've seen in the past, right? I think we could see something like that. And then, Notre Dame has that second half ability. They do have that grit, that joie de vivre, if you will. So looking on the other side of the ball, I do want to see what Notre Dame can do to get the run game going earlier than they did last week, where they had to roll out some answers and make some kind of creative changes. So those are the two big things I think I'm looking for: is how does Notre Dame run early in the game, and how does Ohio State finish drives?
Yeah, that's well said. The two things I'm looking out for this game is, first, like, I think we've seen both of these offenses do really well in terms of the scripted plays and the drives to set up for the rest of the game. And what I mean by that is Ohio State, in a lot of the games they played, they will attack pretty early over the middle, and that's to get the spacing into the middle so they can open up on like Buka and Smith on the outside a bit, and it opens up lanes for their speedy rushers to the outside too. So I would look out for how Chip Kelly's kind of trying to not tip his hand, but maybe show a fake camouflage of tipping his hand a bit to the defenses, because he does that really well into setup. He's really passing, if you're watching the game closely, to set up his run, and that's what he likes to do very specifically. And one thing that he's kind of written is like how many safeties the defense is showing dictates whether I'm running or passing on a given play. And he said that explicitly when he was at Oregon. The other thing I'm looking for is which of these defenses can really limit the explosive plays. I think Texas got pretty close against Ohio State or in the last matchup in terms of doing the exact formula to limit the explosive plays that we saw from Jeremiah Smith against game in Oregon. But Travion Henderson has had a 50-plus yard touchdown every single game in this college football playoff. Like, is this going to be the game that someone actually bottles him up? You take Henderson out of the game, Judkins is kind of a next man up. It's really hard to stop both of them in this game. I think if there's a defense that has the recipe to stop that, I think it could be Notre Dame's defense in this game.
It is hilarious, Quinn, that in the national championship, we are looking at a key facet of the game plan is like, don't let the opposing running back for both teams. Don't let the opposing running back get a 50-yard touchdown run. Like, please just make sure that's like a 20-yard run, not a 50-yard touchdown. Quinn, I know we're going to try to keep the snappy in 20. We do have a question here. I'd love to pull it in and read it. Love that people are here and chatting with us again. Sumer Sports Live, very casual for us, kind of doing this here at the end of the season. Seth William Anderson hops in. Seth, thanks for being here, man. Can we pull any parallels from Ohio State's low-scoring physical games like Nebraska, Penn State, Michigan? And then he asked a question about models and numbers. And I'm going to say, we'll answer the first one. And I will say very confidently, Quinn and I are never going to talk about betting. We're never going to talk about spread. I don't even think we're going to make predictions on this. There's other places for that. Here, we just want to talk ball and kind of have a high level conversation. So we'll keep it away from the models for now. But I do wonder about the physicality. I have said, Quinn, on the record, that Notre Dame is one of, if not the most physical team in college football. Yeah. Are there any parallels to pull there? We've seen Ohio State a little bit struggle in maybe trying to be over physical and when they don't have an edge.
Yeah, I think the Michigan game is the tape you look at in terms of a two-step process of slowing down Notre Dame. You play too high safety, so you limit everything underneath, and then you stop the run. So then what that does is it eliminates Chip Kelly's ability to get yards after the catch, which we know he loves to manufacture at every single offense he's been at. And two, if you take out the running game, he kind of struggles in terms of manufacturing pass outside of that as good as these wide receivers at Ohio State are in terms of getting separation, getting open, which they eventually will, if you limit their yards after the catch, it kind of puts the defense in a little bit of a game plan to chew the clock out for the rest of the game. And you're hoping that you're not getting them into these successful plays, if you will, to really extend drives. And I think that's how you beat Ohio State. And we saw that with Oregon too, is like, force Will Howard not to scramble a little bit, force him to pass the ball and force him to be more of a pocket passer, because I think that's how you get him. If you can take away his number one, and you saw it against Texas, right? Like, he struggled when he wasn't able to look for Jeremiah Smith in some parts of the field that they had to figure out a way to get Egbuka open. And this could end up being Carnell Tate game if you take out both those options.
Yeah. And I think the other kind of underlying question was like, if this becomes a physical game, the question becomes, can Notre Dame's corners match up in man against Ohio State's wide receivers.
Yeah.
That's a tall order. This isn't Notre Dame's number one cornerback unit. They're still very good, but they do rely a lot on kind of the synergy and like the system being very strong. And the more you discretize that, the more you make it an individual game, which is what the physicality in the run game does. It requires numbers, pulls guys up, it isolates those guys out there. That's kind of the question. So a great question from Seth, definitely something to watch there is, does the physicality impact Notre Dame's corners' abilities and put them on an island a little bit? And can Ohio State respond?
And Notre Dame's corners have played at high press per snaps. They play at a high press basis, to where if you have the luxury of a Xavier Watts to double when you need to come out and to fit into run splits, and they have Jordan Clark to come in there as a slot corner to mix and match, I think they can show a lot of different looks and also being physical at the line of scrimmage.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll take the next question here, Parker. We got another one that came in. Seems like Notre Dame is accustomed to grinding out games. They haven't had a talent advantage in any of their playoff games, but they still came out victorious. Speaks to their coaching. Absolutely. I think it's very obvious Notre Dame hired a director of football analytics. He's into the mouthpiece of Marcus Freeman. He helps them on the in-game decision-making, which shows, and they're very aggressive on fourth down, those fourth and short situations, one of the top college football teams in the nation in terms of the aggressiveness on fourth down, which shows that kind of new era thinking in terms of, needing to go and needing to win the margins when you're at a talent disadvantage. And I think teams like Notre Dame get that. Parker, what do you think of this question?
Shout out to Trish, good guy. Glad to see him thriving over there. His staff photo is iconic. Just he looks like a Notre Dame man. I love it. Embracing the analytics over there. I think Timothy, great point. I said that at the very beginning. That was kind of the one thing we learned is that the value of the want to factor of coaching, of culture in college football. Notre Dame, let's put all aside the fan blah blah. Everybody thinks that every fan thinks their coach and their team is like the best. I think we can objectively say outside of that, Notre Dame has a very strong identity, a very strong culture, a very high buy-in. And they're not going to quit. There's, I've said it before, that there's a Rocky Balboa element to this team. And just like we mentioned a little earlier, if this is a one-score game at halftime, Ohio State's in a bad way. Yeah,
absolutely. We appreciate your questions. We're hitting over our 20-minute mark here to give you a little bit of a preview to the national championship. We will be back on Monday to do a reaction to the national championship after it closes. We're very excited about this matchup. Parker, any last words for us before we close it out?
No, gonna be a great game, man. I'm glad we're here reacting. Shout out to all of you that hopped in on a random Thursday night at 10 o'clock Eastern, but glad to be talking ball and looking forward to the game.
All right. Well, I'm Quinn MacLean. He's Parker Fleming, and that's Sumer Sports Live.